Imagine you're a 9-year-old girl, and at age 9, you live in a small town with approximately 20 other families, and though civil war is happening in the country that you live in, the town that you live in is relatively safe and peaceful. And then things begin to change. A group of fighters moves to your town. They come to recruit, and they recruit, or rather force, community members to participate. They come at night. They knock on doors. They beat people. They take men, one per family. And this happens for years. And as the war continues on, the military of your country also come to town. And at first they come to town saying that they're there to help with the fighters that have entered into your hometown. Instead of being a source of help, they become a source of intense fear and harm. Over the course of years, military officials physically and sexually assault community members. Someone is raped by soldiers every 8 to 15 days. And at age 19, it happens to you. You're hurt, bleeding, ashamed. You go to your aunt's house to heal. And your aunt tells you that you should leave the country for safety elsewhere. And after a few days, you do. After a few days, you make a trek northward. You know no one in the country that you move to, but you make the trek northward. And you make it there, and you never return home again. Never again do you see your family. This is the story of Reina Isabel Garcia Martinez of Guatemala. And in 1998, she attempted to receive refugee status in the United States on the basis of her experiences with gender-based violence. The immigration judge hearing her case told her that she could not substantiate that she was a victim of past persecution, and she failed to show, according to this judge, that her attack had anything to do with her race, her religion, her nationality, her membership in a political social group, or her political opinion. Instead, the judge said that her experiences with sexual violence were personal. They were personal in nature, and an act that was done personally by this soldier. There was no evidence that the act was condoned by her government. Reina was denied asylum. Unfortunately, Reina's experiences are not unique. In the United States and around the world, we have a gender problem in the way we recognize refugees and receive refugees. And to address this refugee crisis here and around the world, I think we must begin to think differently about this gender problem. I suggest that to take gender seriously, as well as a number of other categories that force people to flee, sexuality, environmental degradation, poverty, we may need to think about a problem of categories and categorization as a source of what often is used to determine who counts as a refugee, but can then become a source of exclusion. I'm also going to suggest that we have some deep thinking to do about gender and taking gender seriously and gender-based violence seriously. So in my talk for today, what I want to do is to provide a scope of the refugee problem and how gender fits within this. I'll then narrow to the United States to show how the United States has addressed gender in its refugee and asylum system. And then I'm going to end by talking about how us as members of US publics and the global community can begin to think about moving in directions that take gender seriously in addressing the refugee crisis. So, according to the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, there are currently 65.3 million forcibly displaced persons in the world today, and women and girls make up half of that number. And they often experience sexual and gender-based violence as a key of their factors for needing to leave home. And this is much like the experience of Reina. And really, the examples are too many. Reports coming out of the European crisis currently, for example, illustrate that not only is sexual and gender-based violence something that causes one to flee, but it's also a common part of the path to exile, the migration, the movement. Similar accounts have been given by Central American and Mexican women coming to the United States and Canada. The journey can be as harrowing as the reasons for leaving. Sexual violence is at the same time exceptional as it is quite routine and mundane. The United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees also states that it really has no way to prevent this sort of violence that's happening as individuals are fleeing places of conflict. And unfortunately, once women arrive in a country and begin to seek asylum, their ability to gain asylum on the basis of experiences of gender and sexuality-related violence are equally slim. And so I want to turn now to talk about how the US manages this problem, how the US negotiates the gender problem in accepting refugees and asylum seekers. So in the United States, the 1980 Refugee Act is really important in understanding who gets to be a refugee. And under this act, two systems for accepting refugees were established. The first is this system of refugee resettlement. And this is what we hear a lot about when individuals are talking about asylum and refugee resettlement today. In this context, mass groups of people flee civil conflict, often go to another country and take up settlement in a refugee camp. And then at a point, often decades, international workers will say there is no end in sight to the conflict that these individuals had to leave, and so permanent resettlement is really necessary. And so the United States is one country that recognizes and welcomes refugee resettlement programs. This is the process that Syrian refugees that we are learning about currently are working under. The second process is a process of asylum, and this is the process that Reina went through. And this is a process that happens when an individual, or maybe a family, arrives at or within the borders of the United States, and they say, I have been persecuted, or I fear persecution, I need to remain in this country. And then they go through a process of interviews and immigration hearings, and ultimately a judge will decide whether or not you receive asylum. And this is where we're really seeing significant problems in the way gender is being recognized, and specifically with that refugee definition, and also the way in which gender-based violence is seen as political persecution. So if you're like Reina and you're making an asylum claim on the basis of having experienced gender-based violence, something like rape or intimate abuse, the category of relief that you'll ask for is as a person who is a member of a particular social group. So the United Nations also designated and provided us with a definition of who counts as a refugee. And this definition is used throughout the world to decide who is a refugee and who is not a refugee. It states that a refugee is someone outside of their country that has a well-founded fear of persecution on the basis of their race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a social group. I want you to take a minute with this definition. Notice the categories that are named as protected, and what categories are absent. What seems strangely absent to you as a category worthy of protection for refugee status? If you were writing this definition today, what categories would you include? Would you have any at all? Gender, along with many other factors that cause people to flee, is notably absent in this definition. The very construction of a system for managing refugees really creates many exclusions that don't allow people to have access to the protections that they perhaps deserve. And for women like Reina, who have made gender-based claims as members of gendered social groups, the challenges have really been giant. Early on in the United States, women making gender-based claims were told that gender alone could not count as a social group because more than half of a country's population does not count as a social group. It's too big. Other women took a more narrow approach, and they framed their social group in ways such as being members of a social group of poor women who have been battered by their husbands and who oppose male domination. In these cases, the claimants were told that they couldn't count either because they couldn't prove that their husbands were abusing them on the basis of their membership, that their husbands saw them as that group and were thusly persecuting them. Now, in addition to struggling to fit into the definition of a refugee, women claiming gender-based violence as persecution have also been denied asylum because their experiences with violence are seen as personal, not political. This was the case for Olympia Lazo Majano of El Salvador. She came to the United States to seek refuge after a sergeant of the Salvadoran army began to repeatedly and violently physically and sexually assault her, as well as threaten her life. And the judge in her case told her that the case attests to evidence and mistreatment of an individual, but not persecution. The judge continued that Olympia, quote, may indeed have suffered emotional and physical abuse in the course of her personal relationship with Sergeant Zuniga, but such mistreatment is clearly personal in nature and does not constitute political persecution with the meaning of immigration laws. These cases and so many more show us that, particularly in the United States, we have a problem with seeing gender and gender-based violence as anything more than just personal experience. I think we must learn to think differently about gender and gender-based violence if we are significantly going to address the world's refugee crisis. And I want to end by thinking about what that looks like. The first thing that we must do is we must learn to take women's claims seriously, in particular women's claims of violence. This sort of thinking would really mean a culture shift. And it's not just in this international context that this matters, that women's experiences with sexual violence are devalued and discredited. But it's also when we talk about sexual assault on US college campuses, something that 23% of women, undergraduate women in college experience during their time on campus. Or domestic violence, something that 30% of women worldwide experience over the course of their lifetime. Across these contexts, women are not believed, not taken seriously, they're devalued and discredited, especially when they begin to publicly name their experiences. What will it take to take sexual and gender-based violence seriously? I think we must begin by believing women. Second, in addressing the gender dynamic in the refugee crisis, we must begin by centralizing gender as a fundamental aspect of all elements of migration. The need to flee your home, the path to migration, waiting in refugee camps, seeking permanent resettlement. Each moment is fundamentally shaped and impacted by the gender of the person migrating and fleeing. We can do a better job of integrating a gender analysis into policy and procedure and protocol. And according to human rights and aid workers that are on the ground, oftentimes the steps are quite simple and actionable. We must centralize a gender analysis. Finally, I suggest that we may need to go back to the foundations of the modern refugee system and really rethink seriously what categories and categorization do, who categories and categorization serves. In my research about gender and sexuality related asylum cases in the United States, one thing that I found is that rather than being a tool of organization and welcome, these categories, those mentioned in the refugee definition, are often used to exclude more than they include, so that refugee receiving states use them as techniques and tools to say, you can't count or you don't belong, rather than using them to allow people entrance and hospitality. Now, I don't know if I'm suggesting that a definition without categories would impact and change in significant ways the gender problem. I really do believe that that is a culture change. But I think that by centralizing a gender analysis in the way we develop and think about things like refugee processes and systems, we can really begin to take women's lives seriously. And this taking women's lives seriously not only improves women's lives, but every person connected to that woman, her kin, her community. All of these individuals benefit when her experiences are acknowledged and received as valid and worthy of protection. I really believe we can take gender seriously. We must. Thank you.